episodes ahead. Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Halderman, and each week we're going to dive into a different piece of content, film and television, and we're going to talk with some of the biggest names in front of and behind the camera as we dive deep into how they were financed, produced, developed, marketed, and the crazy stories behind how many of them got made. Welcome back to Greenlit, the Buffalo 8 podcast. Today I had a chance to chat with Craig Baumgarten. I don't say this lightly, but it's one of the most fascinating Hollywood backstories I think I've ever heard. Craig came to the entertainment business in Los Angeles in the early 1970s. It's sort of the heyday of things like Laurel Canyon and the rock and roll era and the early days of sort of that really amazing creative spurt that the studios had. I'll let Craig tell his story in his own words, but today we're framing the story around Hook and Blank Check, two projects that were really, really important to me growing up, and I know a lot of people resonated with. Craig is a colleague, and we're producing a project together on the BondIt Media Capital side called Castle Falls with one of his clients, Dolph Lundgren, an action film that we're shooting out in Alabama. Again, really seasoned producer, seasoned manager, and crazy enough, after even having worked with him, I wasn't aware that he was a studio executive for more than a decade and a half. But again, I'll let him tell it in his own words. It's an amazing story. So without further ado, enjoy this podcast with Craig Baumgarten. So today on the podcast, we have producer and manager Craig Baumgarten. Craig, thanks for carving out the time.
Happy to be here.
So BondIt is currently working on a project with Craig and his client Dolph Lundgren called Castle Falls, which has been impacted by coronavirus, and Craig and I are troubleshooting how to get things back on track with that. But Craig has an incredible backstory, an incredible multiple chapter book on his career in this business. But really want to talk about one project in particular to set us up today, which is Blank Check, which was a huge movie for me as a kid, and I know for a lot of people in my age group. Craig, how was Blank Check greenlit?
Well, it was a spec script written by these two guys, Colby Carr and Blake Snyder, and I knew their agent, and she was a kind of indie agent with a small firm, and she snuck me the script. And, in those days, you get studios. It still works that way. Agents would give you, like, you can have Disney, and some other producer would have Warner Brothers. And the writers liked me, and I had a good relationship. So I got Disney because it seemed obviously a Disney movie. And it was, I guess, a couple of years after Home Alone. So, it just seemed and felt like the right movie at the right time. And I loved the script. It was fun. And I actually wanted to remake the script. I think today it's an even more fun movie if you think about what computers can do today and what a smart 12-year-old kid could do with a computer and who he could fool and scam today. But it was right at the very beginning of, kind of like laptops and desktop computers that, were becoming present in people's homes instead of just at a workstation in some office. And it was right when the Apple was in ascendance for the first time. If you remember, this big ascendance, and then they kind of like, Jobs left and they thought the company was over. And then of course he came back, and, now it's, just this behemoth, worldwide. But, and they had just released the Macintosh computer. So, these guys had come up with the idea of this kid finding a check, that was made out to a cashier's check. And of course, he realized he was 10 years old. Nobody would believe he had $1 million check, which, I guess 25 years ago, $1 million was still a lot of money. And, so, he found this check, and then he figured out how to use his computer, and he created this character, Mr. Macintosh. And it was just a fun movie. And Disney bought the script for $1 million, I think, maybe even a little bit more. And the writers were over the moon. They just couldn't believe that they had just literally fallen into, it was the movie. They had fallen into a check for $1 million, and they were two young guys. And, and then it was like, okay, we're going to make the movie right away. And there was a big threshold question in those days. Disney had Disney, which was Disney. And then they had this company called Touchstone, which was Eisner and Katzenberg's idea to be a more adult version of Disney, not racy or, R-rated, but kind of a little, and we begged to make Blank Check a Touchstone movie, just because I think to this day that, if we'd been able to be just a tad, kind of more, hold on, I think I just lost my feed here. If we were able to be just a tad more, I don't know, racy's not the right word, but you know what I mean, adult, I guess.
Yeah.
That, the kids would like it, the adults, older teenagers would pay to see it, like they did for Home Alone, which was this, $300 million movie or something in those days. So, but they wanted it as a Disney movie. They saw this and this kid as the quintessential live action Disney character.
Yeah.
And, that was, that was it. So that's where we were. We ended up, it's a Disney movie. We hired a young filmmaker named Rupert Wainwright, who's still a friend of mine, and went into commercials and, other kinds of, non-narrative filmmaking, and has been very successful in that field for a long time. After Blank Check, but he made this movie, and we fought like crazy, but we were great friends and good partners in the end. But we would have, like I was younger, and we would have screaming fights and have to leave the set together to.
Not you, Craig. Not you with
oh
your
yes, me, absolutely me. Much more so then. And he was a real, he was a volatile guy. But as I say, we're still friends to this day, and I think we made a really good movie, and then, you're just navigating the studio process. You're getting your budget approved. You're getting your cast approved. The good thing is that Disney believed in the concept. So it was never about a star, and the star of the movie was 12 years old anyway, or 11 years old, something like that. And we hired this young man named Brian Bonsall, who had been, I think, in Star Trek, but he was the late in life child on the Michael J. Fox series. I can't remember the name of it now, where he became a star with, I think it was, oh God, you'll have to fill in the series for me. I can't remember, but he was like a TV, not star, but character. And he was just this impossibly cute young kid. And so we cast him, and he and his mother came along, and she was his manager and his acting coach and this and that and all the rest of it. He unfortunately kind of went off the rails after that and ended up out of the business and living in Colorado. And I hope he's doing okay now, but he had some difficulties and stuff like that. But on the show, he was a great kid. He was just funny, and he was great in front of the camera, and he was, one of these impossibly cute young kids. And
he's amazing.
And the cast was just fun. Tone Loc, Miguel Ferrer, and we had this MTV VJ, Karen. Oh God, I should have studied that. If I'd known you were going to Blank Check, I would have studied up on all my names and stuff like this. She was fantastic. She was a great lady.
Is she the bank teller?
No, she was she was like the assistant she was the banker. Yeah, but she wasn't. Yeah. She was like maybe she had been a teller, but she got promoted because she was the liaison to this kid, right, for the bank. And she was. And of course, he developed this impossible crush on her. And then my daughter, who'll kill me for telling this story, was on location with us in Austin where we made the movie, and my daughter and Brian had this like a little 11-year-old love affair, right? Where at some point I'm sure they snuck into some, hideaway somewhere and had their first kiss or whatever, and I remember coming back to LA, and as only you can be when you're like 11 years old and in love, she thought this was it, right? And then, of course, it was a location romance for 11-year-olds. And then as soon as they came back, like they had one, like we took her to go bowling with him one day or something like that. And then he dumped her and she was devastated. It was just hysterical. I mean, as I say, if my daughter ever sees this, she'll kill me. But, they had this 11-year-old love affair. But it was funny because how you go on film locations, and the crew is always in, some, second-rate hotel because, money's always an issue, whether you're making a movie for Disney, whatever. But for whatever reason, there was a Four Seasons on the Colorado River in the middle of downtown Austin, and it was empty. And my line producer convinced them that we could put the entire crew there, and I'll never forget this, for like $50 a night.
Wow.
In the Four Seasons hotel, right?
Excellent.
So I had, most of the crew was out of town. There wasn't a lot of, all the department heads and the key guys and all the cast. And, we set up our production offices in rooms in the hotel and stuff like that. And suffice to say, that was the last time the Four Seasons ever hosted a film crew.
I'm sure.
It was just insane, the bar, what film crews are like, so after a day of shooting, and we couldn't have super long days of shooting because the 12-year-old kids in every scene, right? So we're always like, we've got, what's the little person, I guess is the right word, doubling him, like when we could, so we could extend our day, wearing a wig so we could shoot overs when he wasn't, when he had to be in school or whatever. Luckily it was during the summer, so we didn't have school to worry about, but still we had, limited hours and stuff like that, and his mother was his teacher too. It was like, she had 6 different roles. And
so Craig, I know Michael Lerner, and I've made a number of movies with Michael Lerner over the years.
Wonderful
and
guy.
He's a hysterical, incredibly interesting guy.
Yes.
What was the experience like with him? I mean, that role is so fun for him. And was it before Barton Fink or after Barton Fink?
God, it must have been before Barton Fink, I think.
Okay.
But there were the 3 of them were hysterical. It was Miguel Ferrer, who passed away about 2 years ago. Was a great guy, and had his father was a huge star, Jose Ferrer, and he had this great career that lasted all the way up to the end of his life. Tone Loc, who was a rapper, a one-hit wonder rapper, who had this song I think called "The Wild Thing" or something like that. But he was iconic. He had this deep basso profundo voice, and he was this big kind of just guy. He was just loose guy. And then you had Michael, who was always overweight and was kind of could do anything from serious drama to the Three Stooges because he was such a wonderful actor. He could do anything literally. And the 3 of them were always together, and they were always crazy on camera and off camera, and just had tremendous amount of fun with all of them, and then they had tremendous amount of fun with the kid, right? It was just fun for them because they're always, it was like a Roadrunner cartoon. They're constantly trying to get this kid and get their money back because it was their check, and Michael was the corrupt banker,
Right.
And it was. I mean, the movie's really fun and cute, and the parents were great. It was just top to bottom. It was a pleasure to do. We had, we had a really good production designer who went way over budget and managed to keep it from the line producer, and Disney got involved. And when I say way over budget, we're talking like $100,000 over budget on a $12 million movie or something like that. But, Disney got all, bent out of shape, and we had guys come down, and my line producer who, got in trouble with them, but still has had a great career and does really well. I won't mention his name. It was just, but you know, it was 100 degrees every day in Austin, you know, heat wave. So literally every day, you know, you get in your vehicle and you couldn't touch, you know, the steering wheel for 10 minutes until the air conditioning had been going, because it was just so hot. You'd bake.
How
And then
many
we had
days was that shoot, Craig? How many days did you shoot down there?
I think 50 or something like that. You know, it was a
Okay.
regular studio shoot, and you know, you couldn't shorten it because, you know, you had restrictions on your hours because, you know,
Okay.
Brian was in every, you know, every scene virtually. You know, other than when the, you know, the bad guys were running around scheming. So there wasn't a lot we could do. And then we found, you know, the house, Mr. McIntosh's house, which, you know, the kid manages to buy in Mr. McIntosh's name. We found in the middle of this kind of upper income section of Austin, we found this castle. It was like a medieval castle in the midst of this totally normal neighborhood. You know, it was kind of a it was near the University of Texas, so a lot of faculty people, I think, lived there and stuff like that. And the castle looked so impressive, but inside it was this tiny little house with tiny little rooms and all the rest of it. And as I told you the other day, that I found out last week, this is, you know, a movie we made 25 years ago or something like that, found out last week that Robert Rodriguez bought the house, you know, wonderful filmmaker. And he lives there. And, you know, I think he remodeled it extensively to make it kind of livable. Because as I say, it was kind of inside, it was like a medieval castle inside, but it was really a distinctive character in the movie stuff. It was just a really good experience. You know, sometimes you go on location and every day is torture, you know, whether it's the star or the director or logistical problems or weather or whatever. This was just, you know, a fun shoot. We had a great time. Everybody lived in this one hotel. The bar was like insane every night. And, you know, as I say, by the end of the shoot, they couldn't wait to get us
out of there.
Yeah. And
so Craig, curious. So now the film comes out, so you're done, film comes out, obviously, you know, different theatrical world than today. What was the release like? Did it feel like a hit? Did you know it was going to have staying power? What was that experience like?
It was a middle-sized hit. I remember there was like Disney's second biggest picture that year, but it was a vastly different Disney than today, you know? Mm-hmm. So, you know, I never really I don't remember how it did internationally, you know?
Yeah.
I don't expect that it was a picture that was going to travel well, you know, at that time, especially. But it was successful in the U.S. and we were proud of it. We were happy. We always felt that if we had been able to make it a little bit, you know, tougher, it would have been a bigger hit. But, you know, everybody was happy with it. It opened nicely and it played out for its, you know, 4 to 5, 6 week run. And I think in retrospect, people think it's more successful than it was because, you know, it just became, you know, iconic for the kids. And it was the early days of, you know, a deep penetration in home videos, you know, where you could buy home videos instead of rent it. You know, we went through that period, very beginning of home video in the early 80s, where, you know, everybody thought it was going to be a rental market. So, you know, you had the Blockbusters of the world buy these video cassettes for $90 and then they'd rent them out. And then, you know, around this time was when the studios decided they do much better doing a sell-through model and selling the videos. And, you know, and they weren't DVDs yet, but they were VHS cassettes. They were smaller than the old, you know, big 3/4 inch cassettes. And so it sold a lot because, you know, Disney still to this day sells a lot because kids will watch something they like 50 times, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what happened and, you know, it's funny being older and still being around and stuff. I run into people, you know, like you and others that have seen Blank Check or seen Hook. And, you know, it's always nice, you know, when, you know, you find out that these movies have had, a real impact. They really have lasted with people for, 20, 30 years now, I mean, Universal Soldier is another movie like that, Universal Soldier is has a real resonance with, young men that have seen it, and, and they all still play over and over and over again. So new generations have seen them. It's kind of fun.
So shifting gears for a moment, I want to come back to Universal Soldier and to your relationship with Dolph and that whole side of your career and your business now. But I'm curious, you've had a really interesting sort of straddling of both lines, the studio world and then the independent world, and you've seen the evolution of this business over a pretty good period of time. Walk us through your career in the studio system, the benefits of that, the transition into independence, and then I think even more so, interestingly, the transition of where the business is today as it sits.
Well, I never thought I'd be a studio executive. I don't even think I knew what studio executives were when I decided I wanted to be a movie producer. I was sitting in New York. I had produced a play off Broadway that became very successful and, and a bit iconic called Women Behind Bars, written by a man named Tom Ian, who became was a very successful New York playwright. And he wanted to write a movie. So I commissioned him to write a movie for, I don't know, like $2,000 or $3,000. And he wrote a script for me. None of us knew about the Writers Guild or anything in those days. And he had never written a movie. And the script was terrible, but, because he just, didn't really kind of have interest in writing movies. He just wanted to write something. And I mean, he did, but he didn't want to study what a movie was, what he needed to do to write a movie as opposed to a stage play. And, it was just off the wall, and I didn't know any better at the time. But I decided I'd like to make independent movies, and, so I just literally picked up my life, got it a long time ago, 1976, and I moved to Los Angeles. And I didn't have a job. I knew a few people, and I sublet a house from a friend of mine who was in Ireland making a movie. And he had this great house up in Laurel Canyon that, at the time I thought was like a palace, and he had a pool. And so I didn't have a job, and I was single, and I was living in this house with a pool. So I just started inviting people to my house for parties like every other weekend. And I had parties, and I started to meet people. And, we were all young in those days, and we were crazy. I mean, it was just a completely different ethos in terms of how we lived our lives, and, what we thought was acceptable behavior, et cetera. But, we'd have people over. I mean, they weren't orgies. I'm not doing that. You just, you'd meet girls, and women, or you'd smoke joints with people you never met, and, whatever that was. And I started to get to know a lot of people. And I was really good friends with a young actor who was just starting to bubble up, whose name was Richard Gere. And Richard and I were close friends, and we decided he was just starting to get done looking for Mr. Goodbar, and he'd done a movie called Blood Brothers, and I think he had just done Days of Heaven. And so we decided to go to Paramount, where we knew this executive, and pitch a movie idea to him that Richard would star in and I would produce. And they bought it, and it was a book, and, it was set in Vegas, and it was a great idea, but, we developed a script. It didn't go anywhere, but I was in England visiting Richard and talking about our project on Paramount's dime. We'd gotten the first draft in, so we were going over the script. And just by happenstance, this executive who had bought the script was in London on other business. So we hung out one night, had dinner, and then sat up in his hotel room and talked about life and shit. And he said, "You got to come to Paramount and be an executive." And I said, "That's crazy. I'm not an executive. I'm not the type. I don't have the corporate thing down. And he said, no. He said, "You got to do this." And I said, "Well, I'll think about it," which was kind of stupid because it was a great opportunity. I was a struggling independent producer who may or may not have ever gotten a movie made, in Los Angeles. And, you know, I remember getting on the phone with my dad at the time, and, you know, he said, "Well, that's crazy. Of course you got to do it." And I said, "Why?" I said, "I don't." He said, "Well, my brother was a baseball player at the time, you know, professional baseball player, and he was in the minor leagues." And my dad said, "Well, if Ross got called up to the major leagues, he's going, right?" He said, "You're in the minor leagues. You just got called up to the majors." And, you know, sometimes people say something to you and it just resonates in the moment and it clicks. And I thought, yeah, of course I got to do this. So I did. And I went and became an executive at Paramount. And at the time at Paramount, Barry Diller was chairman. Michael Eisner was president of the motion picture division. Frank Mancuso was head of distribution and marketing. Don Simpson was head of production, and the three production VPs were Jeffrey Katzenberg, me, and Dawn Steele. That was quite a group of people. And then Larry Mark was in marketing at the time. When I left to go back into production, he took my office and my job. It was like, you know, I always say to people, it was like being in the 1927 Yankees, you know? I mean, I was batting seventh, but I was with the Yankees, you know? And
Right.
And, you know, it was an education. I never went to school for film. I never thought I'd be in film. I thought I'd be in politics. Katzenberg and I were friends in New York. We worked for John Lindsay, who was mayor of New York. Neither of us, we knew guys in the film business like Dan Melnick and others, but we never, ever thought we'd be in the entertainment business. And then, you know, our lives just kind of diverged and came back together, and we were, you know, creative execs at Paramount together. And, you know, Don and Jeff and I we were like the three amigos. We went everywhere together. We did everything together. We coined the phrase, which I still tell people, if you don't go in on Saturday, don't come in on Sunday.
Right.
And that was our work ethic. That defined how we approached our job. Monday through Friday, we were in the office. We were doing meetings. We were buying scripts. We were supervising movies. And every Saturday morning, we get in the office at like 8 a.m. And the three of us would go into our respective offices on the same hallway, and we'd start reading scripts. You know, there were no iPads in those days, no digital. We had a stack of scripts, you know, this, I'm trying to get my hands in, you know, to the frame, this high, you know. And so we'd read a script, and if it was no good, we'd, you know, tell the other two guys, don't read this one. And if it was good, we started making notes. I think we were the first studio to do detailed script notes. Before then, believe it or not, you know, there weren't formal script memos that I'm aware of that studios did, and we started doing that. Didn't always make us very popular with writers, directors, you know, to get the notes from, you know, these three young, you know, kids. You know, we were basically, you know, Don might have been 30, Jeff and I were in our 20s, you know.
What films were you getting made out of that era? What movies were coming out of that time?
It was an incredible era. It was an incredible era. The very first Star Trek film was made. Officer and a Gentleman, American Gigolo. First two movies I was an executive on were American Gigolo and Escape from Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood.
Wow.
And Don Siegel was the director of that movie. You know, he was a legendary director. And Katzenberg supervised the first Star Trek movie, which was directed by Robert Wise, you know, who had another guy who was, you know, 40 years older than Jeff and I, but an iconic filmmaker.
Yeah.
You know, I was executive on North Dallas 40, which is to this day considered one of the best sports movies ever made, and started a lifelong friendship with Ted Kotcheff, who became one of my first clients when I started managing 20 years later, 15 years later. You know, it was just this incredibly exciting time in the film business. You know, we did Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know, I remember when that came in. We did Popeye, which was a hysterical experience because Popeye was Bob Evans, of course, who just passed, but was, you know, one of the great characters and geniuses of our, you know, film of our time growing up. Yeah. And he had taught Bob Altman, who was kind of the quintessential indie filmmaker, to direct this big budget Hollywood cartoon-like movie called Popeye, And the two of them went off to Malta, where there was the only tank in the world at the time big enough to do it. And they went off to Malta and they made this movie. And so every morning we would have a production meeting in Eisner's office. And every morning it started off, because, you know, like 9 or 10, whenever we would do it, was the end of the day in Malta, 9 hours later, right? Every meeting would start off with Eisner yelling at either Evans or Altman, whoever he could get on the phone, because the movie was financially was a disaster. Went millions and millions of dollars over budget. God only knows what Bob was doing, in Malta, flying, girls and whatever else in. And Altman was busy trying to ignore everybody and everything, right? He didn't want to deal with the studio. He didn't want to deal with Bob. So after the call to Altman, there was the call to his agent, Sam Cohn, who was in New York. And Sam was a great agent who represented Altman and Fosse and Woody Allen and Sidney Lumet. And I mean, on and on and on, and there was a big New York filmmaking business in those days where great filmmakers, established, powerful filmmakers lived in New York. And almost all of them were represented by Sam. He'd then get on the phone with Sam Cohn, and Sam Cohn would look, just, I'm sure he would like hold the phone away from his ear like that, and, at the end, Eisner would calm down, and then we'd do it again the next day. And, they just basically ignored us. They knew they were in Malta. And in those days, being in Malta, you could have been on the moon. There was nothing you could do about it. There was nothing we could do that would make Altman go faster, or, we weren't going to fire Bob Altman off the movie. It was this incredible thing that Bob Altman was directing his first mainstream commercial movie.
Yep.
It was, and it was just great. I mean, I learned so much from Eisner, who was kind of a genius, in that, he used to just understand stuff. We made Airplane during that time, and, that's one of the great stories ever, because Michael Eisner was at a dinner, like a kind of dinner party at somebody's house, and he got seated next to a woman who was, married to somebody rich and important. I don't know who, I don't remember. But she was a reader at, I think, Orion at the time. Or no, maybe it was United Artists. Maybe it was before Orion. She was a reader at United Artists. And Eisner was always kind of a character and, and very chatty. And so he turned to her and said, okay, great. She was complaining that as a reader in the studio system, nobody ever paid attention to her. That whatever she read, she recommended, never got made, never moved forward. And she was saying, I don't even know why you guys have readers. You don't listen to us. You don't care what we have to say. So Eisner said to her, okay, tell me the best script you read that nobody made. And she said, well, there's this script that I read. You should read it. And the script was Airplane. And the script was written by these three guys who nobody had heard of at the time, named Zucker, and Abrams, the two, Jerry and David Zucker, who were brothers, and Jim Abrams. And they all came from Eagle River, Wisconsin, which is where I went to camp when I was like 10 years old. And they had written a sketch comedy movie. It was a period in the 70s, they were doing these sketch comedy movies, kind of a Saturday Night Live precursor, called Kentucky Fried Movie. And Kentucky Fried Movie was a minor hit. And it was the first film directed by a guy nobody had heard of named John Landis, who went on and became one of the biggest comedy directors of all time. And Michael and we all read the script. He made us all read the script. It was hysterical. I mean, it was Airplane. I mean, everybody in the world seen Airplane, laughed at Airplane for 45 years now. And it was hysterical, but here was the trick. The only way they would do it is if the three of them could direct the movie together. First of all, the DGA didn't allow three directors. They had reluctantly allowed co-directing, but they had never allowed three people to direct a movie. It was a violation. We needed to get a waiver from the DGA. And nothing was more terrifying than having not one inexperienced director, but three inexperienced directors who conceivably, from our mind, could sit in that directing booth and argue away the day while they got into stuff. And we didn't know them well or anything. And so Michael's idea was to hire a veteran producer. So he hired a guy named Howard Koch, who was Hawk Koch's dad and was a big producer forever, but a real line producer, a guy who got into stuff. And we made Airplane. And, we had huge fights with them because, we had all these comedy roles and they wanted to cast all these dramatic actors. They wanted Lloyd Bridges, and I never forget, they insisted on Kareem Abdul-Jabbar playing the pilot, which becomes an iconic thing. And Leslie Nielsen had never done a comedy before then, and of course became this, huge comedy actor. And George Kennedy, who had been in Airport, so they had to have him in Airplane where he could spoof what he did in Airport. And, and we kept saying, but these guys don't do comedy. They're not funny. And they kept saying, that's the point. The point is they're not funny. They're going to play it straight, and that's what's going to be funny. And I don't think we would have trusted them, but Eisner said, listen, we're in for a penny, we're in for a pound. We're making this movie with these guys. We trusted them. And I'll never forget, we saw the first rough cut on studio research screening in front of an audience. It did pretty well, but it was really long. And I remember we kind of went back into our offices. Don and I and Jeff were all sitting there and no, it's not a disaster. It's okay. It's, we won't be embarrassed by it. And Eisner come bounding in, and he had all this energy. Michael was a ball of energy, and he come bounding into the room, and it's hysterical. You know who's calling me? He's now trying me on my phone. It's Ted Kotcheff. He just mentioned Ted Kotcheff. Anyway, came bounding into the room with all this energy, and he said, this is going to be huge. This is going to be giant. This is a fantastic hit movie. And then he left the room, and we all looked at each other and said, oh, that's Michael. But that was Michael, and Michael was right. It was a sensation. And believe it or not, here's another thing that was great about Paramount in those days. Frank Mancuso was head of distribution and marketing. And he said, we're going to release this movie wide everywhere in the country, which you didn't do on all your movies in those days. And we're going to do it on the 4th of July weekend. Mm. And everybody thought Frank was crazy. And the filmmakers thought we were dumping the movie because there had never been a hit movie on the 4th of July weekend. It was not a weekend people went to the movies. They were out at fireworks displays and beaches and parks and picnics. No one ever thought 4th of July was a good time to release a movie. And I'll never forget the pictures on the news that opening weekend, like it was the Wednesday before, right away, of people lined up around the block to see Airplane because nobody knew anybody in it. Nobody cared about Leslie Nielsen or George Kennedy, and Robert Hayes was nobody knew who he was. And they were lined up because the trailers were so funny, and the bits in the movie and the promotion on television was, and everybody went to see the movie, and it was a massive 4th of July weekend success.
I love it, Craig.
Yeah.
I love it. It's so fun. So how do you get from that life to the world of independence and the world of today's independence, which are just, it's basically a different industry?
Well, I still go back and forth. I have studio movies that I'm working on. I do a lot of television, as you know, and we finance our own TV and, television movies and stuff like that. And I got into independent, action movies really after the first Universal Soldier. Dolph became, hot, and I had a script that I wanted him to do. And my friend Ted Kotcheff, who just called me, was the director. And it was the first movie ever made written by a man named Billy Ray, who's become one of the biggest writers in our business and now a director. And later I produced his first movie as a director called Shattered Glass, which was an independent movie. So we got Dolph in this movie, and that financed the movie in those days. And I think we had like a $9 million budget, and we went to Prague because it was kind of an international movie. And Eastern Europe was literally just opening up. The Hungarians and the Russians, or the Hungarians and the Czechs had thrown out the Russians. The Soviet Union was crumbling, and all these fledgling economies were looking for movies. And, it was a good place to make a movie. So we made this movie, which I think ended up being called The Last Assassin or something like that. We made it under the title shooter, and we ended up selling it to Miramax. It's the only deal in my whole life I ever did with Harvey Weinstein. And, movie was released theatrically, didn't do great, but, it was fine. And we financed it independently. And I said, oh, this is another way to do stuff,
Yeah.
And
what was the year, Craig?
I want to say 93, 94, somewhere in, I'd have to look it up. But
no, it's okay. That's
it
helpful.
was early 90s. We made Universal Soldier, I think, 92. And then I made a movie at Columbia with Jean-Claude Van Damme. And then I made this movie with Dolph. And, so since then, I've kind of been going back and forth. I ended my studio time in 1988 at 20th Century Fox. I was fired. It was the Saturday Night Massacre. I was fired, and the head of physical production was a man named Gene Levy. We were fired. I was acting head of production at the time. Scott Rudin just left, and I thought I was going to get the job as head of production. And I was the acting head of production at the time, waiting to be anointed. And we had a little movie called The Abyss with Jim Cameron, which Gene and I figured out really brilliantly we were going to do under, I think there was some kind of Article 17 or something like that, or something. We could do it as a negative pickup. Studios didn't do negative pickups in those days. We could do it as a negative pickup, and we figured out that would be a better way to do it, because we were going to make the movie in South Carolina, where Jim Cameron had found an abandoned nuclear power plant that had a tank that had never had nuclear material in it because they abandoned it before they finished it. And so he needed this huge tank for The Abyss. And so they had all these cooling tanks and things around there. So we just moved into this abandoned nuclear power plant and rented it for 6 months and started renovating the tanks. Anyway, the movie went massively over budget. And, and Cameron, of course, as we later found out, but nobody knew before then, didn't care. And so his producer at the time was his now ex-wife Gail Ann Hurd, who he'd been married to and had divorced, but they were the producer director of this movie. And basically they did everything they could to get their own way, and Rupert Murdoch and Barry Diller couldn't fire them, so they fired Gene Levy and I. And that was the end of my studio career. At that point I decided, okay, I'm not gonna be the senior number one guy at a movie studio. And, this in and out, up and down life wasn't for me. And I was just going to go do my own thing. So I started producing movies. And that's, in that era, we did Hook, and we did Universal Soldier, and we did Blank Check, and we did It Could Happen to You. And, I had a great run, in the studio business. And then I started managing, and managing kind of led me into independent financing, because I represent a lot of people that, had a tough time getting studio movies made.
Right.
But, had great careers and track records, and, you could put together indie movies with them. And I signed Ted Kotcheff. This was after we had done the movie together. And he went on and became, for 13 years, ran Law and Order Special Victims Unit. And I just, just kind of slid into it. And I got familiar with it, and I learned quickly, and I listened, and so I've been able to make a lot of independent movies through the years.
Craig, I would be I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about Hook. I love the film. I think a lot of people love the film, obviously.
Yeah.
In terms of how it's slotted into this story, so 88, you're done with the studio world.
Yeah.
You're now out on your own. You're starting to package and put projects together. Yeah. How does Hook come about, and what does that process look like?
We knew this writer named Jim Hart, and Jim had an idea that he was trying to sell for a couple of years, which was basically Peter Pan as a grown-up. but it was a dark story. It was just, he was tortured and troubled and didn't really want to be a grown-up, and he was married and his marriage wasn't working. And he started to tell me the story one day. We were working on something else. And I just, in my brain, I said, this is a home run idea, but you got it wrong, Jim. Nobody wants to see a dark, unhappy movie about Peter Pan. They want to see, you can have him go through a struggle, but he's got to triumph at the end. He's got to have this epiphany, and we've got to figure out how to make this a feel-good movie, because it's Peter Pan, for Christ's sake. It's not, Diary of a Mad Housewife, or one, was the Ray Milland movie, the alcoholic movie, At any rate, so we worked on it, and we brought in this wonderful filmmaker named Nick Castle, who I had done The Boy Who Could Fly with when I was running Lorimar, and he had made The Last Starfighter, and he was kind of a guy who had a great ear for fantasy, and and had made a lot of movies about kids and stuff like that. And he loved the idea. We all loved the idea. We just thought, this is a home run idea, and we took it right away to Jeff Sagansky, who was running TriStar at the time, which was a standalone, division of Sony, or at the time Coca-Cola, I think. But it was just a perfect movie for him. He loved it immediately, put it right into development. And Jim started writing, and Nick supervises the director, and Gary Adelson and I, my partner, we were the producers. And we all thought, this is going to be a huge, huge hit movie. And then Jeff Sagansky got fired. Or quit, I don't remember. I think he got fired. And, Goober and Peters had just taken over all of Sony, and they hired Mark Canton to run Columbia. It had just become Sony. It was bought. So they had Mark Canton run Columbia, and they hired Mike Medavoy to run TriStar. Mike's a great guy and is a really smart guy, but I don't think he got the movie initially, but as an idea when it was pitched to him. But he said, okay, well, let's see what the script looks like. And the script came in, and to his credit, he read the script over a weekend and came in Monday morning and said, we're making this movie. And so we started casting, and it's the only time in my, 50, 60 movies where we sat around with the studio and we said, okay, we got two big roles. We got Peter Pan, we got him, and we got Captain Hook. And who are your dream actors? And we started talking about all the big stars at the time, Tom Hanks, Tom Cruise, and, we just made our list. And at the end of the meeting, we looked at each other and said, we got to go to Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman. Those are the guys. And we did. And Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman said yes. What I didn't know at the time was that Dustin Hoffman read the script, called his agent, Mike Ovitz, and said, I want to do this movie. Can we get Steven Spielberg to direct it? And, there's a director on the movie, who had a deal at TriStar. And, I don't think they ever told Steven that, because they're, kind of director courtesy rules and stuff like that. So they just gave Steven the script. And by the way, it may be that nobody told Dustin there was a director on the project. I don't know. I wasn't in the loop of those conversations. And anyway, Steven Spielberg read it and said, yeah, I'd like to direct this.
Yep.
And so now you've got Robin Williams, Dustin Hoffman, and Steven Spielberg. And, arguably it was, and at this moment in time, Dustin was coming off of, oh God, my brain is not working today. The movie he did with Tom Cruise.
Oh yeah, the Rain Man.
Rain Man, sorry. He was coming off of Rain Man, and Robin was coming off just a string of everything. I mean, Good Morning Vietnam, every movie that Robin had done at that point was a massive hit movie. He was the biggest comedy star in the world. And Dustin's coming off of Rain Man, and they both said yes. And now we've got Steven Spielberg directing the movie. is the biggest director of all time. And so, to say that this is a fantasy come true for a producer that's only going to happen once in your life, that's an understatement of it all.
Yeah.
But Steven at the time, I think he's mellowed since then. But at the time, Steven had a rule that, he didn't like multiple producers on his movies. He didn't want anybody to get credit on his movies, but his team. And so, we had to be off the movie. And again, I didn't discuss this with Steven directly, so I can't tell you whether he was involved or whether Ovitz just decided this is the way to, please him, or whether his lawyer came in and said, these are the rules if you want to be in business with Steven Spielberg. But it came down to us. First, Nick Castle had to be taken care of, and he made a deal to leave the project, and they gave him another movie to direct, which he directed and stuff like that. So Nick was okay. And then they came to Gary and I, and they said, okay, you guys are off. We're firing you. I need to fire us. We just developed a script that Steven Spielberg, Dustin Hoffman, and Robin Williams all want to do together. It's going to be the biggest movie of the year next Christmas. And you want to fire us for what? We didn't do a good job? And, what a lot of people don't realize, I did, because I had been a studio executive for 10 years, is that there are a clause in almost every producer's contract where you can be fired without cause. It's just if the studio changes their mind and doesn't want you around, they can fire you. Well, the clause had been challenged and lost in court on another movie at Warner Brothers about 2 years before that. And so we said, no, you can't do this to us. And they said, we can do whatever we want. The irony is that the legal department at Columbia had worked for me 5 years earlier when I was, 8 years earlier when I was at the studio. The same chief legal officer and business, they were all there. And they all worked for me. And we always got along. We were great friends. And we became great friends after this. But during this, we weren't.
Yeah.
And, they just said, we can do whatever we want. We're, TriStar Sony Pictures now. And, all kinds of weird things, transpired. And I realized that we were either going to get thrown off the movie and get a check, but not have a credit or anything, or we were going to have to fight.
Yep.
And I turned to my wife at the time and I said, you know what? I just can't be in a situation where I'm telling my grandchildren 30 years from now that I was the producer of Hook, and they go look at the video box or the credits on the screen and I'm not there and I look like I made it up, Right. And I just said, I can't do that. And so we hired a lawyer named Larry Stein, who was a litigator. And CAA was in the middle of this. Mike was really Mike Ovitz was kind of in charge of it all. And I called Ronnie Meyer, who was his partner at the time. And I said, Ronnie, we've all been friends for so long and you guys can't really do this to me. And Ronnie said, well, let me talk to Mike and we'll see. And it didn't go anywhere. And it's progressing. And we draft a formal complaint and Larry Stein delivers it to the studio and to CAA, because we were really on a suicide mission. We were not only suing Sony, we were suing CAA, which literally, meant that was that, in terms of my filmmaking career. I thought so we got to win a lot of money because I may never, ever work again in this town. And, we delivered the complaint to them on, I'll never forget, it was like a Monday or Tuesday before Christmas break, right? That Friday was when everybody, leaves town and doesn't come back till after the new year. And we delivered to them and said, we're going to file this at noon on Friday before Christmas break. And then there's no going back. So we sat, and I remember that Friday morning, I'm sitting in my office. Most people have gone on vacation, and I'm going on vacation Saturday, but I'm sitting in my office because I'm going to sit there till noon so that if there's a call to try and resolve this, I'm going to be there. And at about 11 o'clock in the morning, I get a call, not from Sony. And, I'm friends with Goober, who was great, but wasn't going to go up against Steven or Ovitz. And I'm friends with Medavoy, and he was, I think they both totally got the situation. They both had spent their time as producers and stuff, but they weren't going to go up against these guys. So at about 11 o'clock in the morning, I literally get a phone call from Ronnie Meyer. And he said, Craig, you're really going to go through this? I said, I have to. I just have to. And he said, okay, hold on a second. I'm going to get Mike on the phone. So Ovitz gets on the phone, and the three of us are on the phone, and Ovitz starts yelling at me and literally has said to me, like, you'll never work again in this town. I'll make sure you never get another job. You'll never, ever see the light of day as a producer. And I said, well, Mike, I just, I hear you, and you got to do what you got to do, but I'm just not going to let go of this.
Right.
And our lawyers had told us we had about a 20% chance of getting a preliminary injunction because the movie's already in prep, right? They're building stages. Steven wasn't going to leave Los Angeles. He was going to make the entire movie on a sound stage. The only way he would do it. So they're building, Neverland. They're building all these massive stages, huge, huge sets. And, we built the Captain Hook ship on a soundstage in a lagoon, with the lagoon, the whole 9 yards. So Ovitz finally said to me, okay, we'll work this out. You'll get your credit. You'll get X amount of money, which is a lot of money as a fee. And you have my word. He said, but it's 11:30 on Friday morning, and everybody in the world's gone. And he was in Aspen. I think Ronnie was in Hawaii or wherever they were, Mexico, and, all on the phone together. And I remember saying to Mike, two things, Mike. I said, one, when we get back after January, I said, I'll trust you. But when we get back in January, you're not going to call me and say, I tried and I couldn't work it out, or try and renegotiate this again, or try and get me to change my mind. The deal's done and you're going to honor this deal. And he said, yes. And I said, one other thing. He said, what's that? I said, I want 2 first-class tickets to the world premiere for my wife and I, and 2 for Gary and his wife. I said, no matter what, wherever it is. And I knew where it was going to be. It was going to be in London, and it was going to be a royal premiere, which it was. And because Great Ormond Street Hospital is a royal charity in for the royal family. And that's bullshit. And I said, that's what I want. And he said, okay, I don't give a fuck about that. we got both of those things. And, he came back. He was a man of his word. Ovitz was tough as nails, but he wasn't a liar. He was an honest guy in all his dealings with me. And I got it. And we signed and we did it. And, the movie was made. It's a wonderful movie. And, I got to, come to the set and hang out. All was forgiven and stuff like that a little bit. Brought my daughter, who, you can imagine, at the time she was whatever, 9, 10 years old. And she got to come to the set and take photographs with Dustin Hoffman in his Hook costume and all the rest of it. And the final piece of the story is that the royal premiere, which happened a year later in London, big, huge benefit, was it was the first time that Princess Diana brought both Harry and Will to a royal premiere. So we were at the royal premiere with the 3 of them.
That's so great. That's awesome.
And it was fun.
That's
it
awesome.
Was great, and that was it. It was just it was a great experience. But sometimes in Hollywood, when you're
a
producer, you got to fight. There just are, you're always the easiest guy to, push aside. You can't. The director you got to deal with, the movie stars you're stuck with. So that if you need to squeeze somebody, the producer's squeezable, as I say. And so sometimes you got to give and be squeezed, because that's just, you got to be realistic. And sometimes you just got to know, you're going to set a line, you're going to set a line. That's that.
Greg, I love the story. I really appreciate you spending the time, dude. It's awesome.
Thanks for having me.
It's funny. We've worked together, and I never knew 90% of this background about your life.
Oh
It's
yeah,
awesome.
There's more.
I'm
But enough
sure.
for today. Thank you so
I'm
much.
sure.
All right,
I appreciate you spending the time. Thank you so much,
my
and
pleasure.
we'll catch up soon.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Craig.
Bye.
Thank you all for listening to another episode of Greenlit, the Buffalo 8 podcast. For financing questions, feel free to contact us at BondIt Media Capital at info@bondit.us. For production, development, and distribution questions, feel free to contact us at Buffalo 8, info@buffalo8.com. We'd love to hear from you and hope you'll continue listening to the podcast episodes ahead.